Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 345 library systems across the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the wonderful best-selling, prize-winning, and acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, we are happy to welcome New York Times bestselling author Amor Towles to talk to us about his journey as a writer and his beautiful body of work. Welcome, Amor. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here, Brandon.
Likewise, we're so happy to have you. Everybody's super excited to get started. Before we begin, I do want to pause and give everybody that standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly. We have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, so thank you everyone for doing that. But we are going to continue to take your additional questions throughout this conversation. So when you have a direct question for Amor, you can click that questions tab that's just below this live stream video at any time to submit your question. Please keep in mind there are a lot of you tuning in this evening, so we'll get to as many questions as we can. If you are unable to attend the full talk for any reason, you will receive a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours. In that email, you can find a link to the recording, which will be available for 60 days. Now, to formally introduce our guest. Born and raised in the Boston area, Amor Towles graduated from Yale College and received an MA in English from Stanford University. As well as Rules of Civility, A Gentleman in Moscow, and The Lincoln Highway, Mr. Towles is also the author of the ebook, You Have Arrived at Your Destination, part of Amazon's Forward collection. He also edited and wrote the introduction for the Mysterious Bookshop Presents the Best Mystery Stories of the Year 2023. His next book, Table for Two, is a collection of short stories to be published in April 2024. Mr. Towles is the 2023 Peggy V. Helmrich Distinguished Author Award recipient, Having worked as an investment professional for over 20 years, Mr. Towles now devotes himself full-time to writing in Manhattan, where he lives with his wife and 2 children. Without further ado, thank you again for being here. Welcome. How are you this evening?
I'm great. Thanks very much. And let me start by saying thanks to all of you who are tuned in from around the country, around the world. I love that this service has been created to allow readers in far and wide to connect with authors through their libraries. It's the ideal situation.
Absolutely. And we're so happy to see so many people tune in for the authors that we host, especially this evening. And I do have to say that one of the questions that we get the most from every author talk is people wanting to know about the writer's journey. How did you get to where you are today? How long have you been writing? Can you talk to us a little bit about your journey as a writer?
Sure. I decided I wanted to be a writer when I was in first grade. My teacher in first grade, Mrs. Gom, invited a friend of hers who was a juvenile poet, of reasonably well known in the New England area, named David McCord, to come and speak to our class. He read from his various books, poems that would have been written for the young. And I just was so amazed by that. It was the greatest thing. I couldn't believe it. I thought he was cool. I thought the poems were cool. I thought that, the fact that we were all listening to something that he had created was cool. And so that night I went home and we got to get, some of his poetry books, and he signed them, and that was exciting. And went home and read his poems. And then I began writing poems that were versions of what he wrote, I guess, sort of copying his style. And that was the beginning. And it just went from there. I knew I wanted to be a writer. And so from that point forward, I would just read somebody and get interested in their work, and write, write immediately after, influenced by whatever that work was. And so when I was young, it started with the Hardy Boys, which I read from volume 1 through, after volume 50. And then it was the short stories of Ray Bradbury, and as a young person, I think it was Ian Fleming's James Bond series. But then eventually, of course, you get to high school and you start to read books of greater substance, and then the doors of literature opened wide, and I've never looked back. Now I say that, but as many of you know, I was writing fiction in high school. I wrote it in college. I wrote it in graduate school. I moved to New York City at the age of 25 with the intention of writing fiction, but I was feeling a little claustrophobic, a little lonely, and I was broke. I was writing at that age in New York. And so I joined a friend of mine who had started an investment firm. And 20 years later, we were still working side by side. So my life did take a different direction. And about 10 years into that career, I began writing on the weekends again, thank God. I spent 7 years writing a book I didn't like. I set that aside. But I learned a lot from writing that failed novel. Most importantly, I learned was that I'm an outliner. I had not outlined that book. It created all kinds of problems for me. So I decided, okay, I'll start a new book, totally new topic. I'll outline it carefully. I'll give myself a year to write the first draft. And that's what I did. I wrote a book over a year, a first draft, and then revised it several times over the next couple of years. And that was Rules of Civility. And when that became a bestseller, I retired from the firm. So even though I've written fiction my whole life, from a professional standpoint, I got kind of a late start.
Yeah, you took a 10-year hiatus
Yeah.
from writing and then wrote a New York Times bestseller. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, yeah. I wouldn't recommend the 10-year hiatus for artists. It's not the best way to go about things, but it was what happened.
Mm-hmm. But over your lifespan, though, you've had a couple of pretty big mentors, one being by complete happenstance through a message in a bottle. And I know you've told this story a million times, but it's such a fascinating story.
Well, yeah, man, what Brandon's referring to, I guess, and mentor maybe is too strong a word in a way, but when I was about 8 years old, I did put a message in a bottle and threw it into the Atlantic Ocean. And as it turned out, at the end of the summer, when I got home, there was a letter waiting for me from a Harrison Salisbury, who was one of the senior editors of the New York Times. He had found the bottle and he had the good grace to write me back. And that became a correspondence that lasted from the time I was 8 until I was 18. And then eventually I met him at the age of 18, my first trip to New York City. And, he was an incredibly gracious person and a giant in the world of journalism. He had been, a correspondent in Vietnam. He'd been a correspondent in the Second World War. He was the Moscow bureau chief at the end of the Second World War during the rise of the Cold War. He oversaw the launch of the op-ed page in the New York Times. He really was an amazing person. And so when I ended up writing A Gentleman in Moscow, given the fact that he was there in Moscow at the time that Gentleman in Moscow kind of is drawing to its conclusion, that story, I put him in the book. So Harrison Salisbury is a character in the final pages of that book, which was my tribute to this gentleman who had been so kind to me.
Mm-hmm. Does Harrison Salisbury have anything to do with your interest in Russian history?
No.
So when you were at college, then you also met Peter Matheson. He came to teach there, and he did become, I guess, more of a mentor, correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Peter Matheson was, among other things, he was one of the people who launched the Paris Review, the revered literary journal, but was a great novelist and naturalist, writer of nonfiction of his generation, one of the greats of his generation. And he came to Yale while I was a student there. I applied to teach for a semester. I applied to get into his seminar, and he really sort of tapped me on the shoulder to say that he thought that I could do this, that I might be gifted at this strange art of writing fiction, and that was really the first time where sort of an external person who I admired, who had a person of great literary achievement, identified the quality in my work as having promise, and obviously that had an enormous influence on me, and kind of really got me started with a greater level of confidence. And like I say to young people, you don't need someone like that to reach out and compliment you and express their confidence in you every year. You need it like once every decade. It's fine, because you can carry that confidence that they express in you with you for a decade and rely on it and benefit from it and use it as an encouragement to press on. But Peter then ended up becoming a good friend and was a mentor of me, all the way for the remainder of his life. He was very disappointed when I stopped writing for that 10-year period, and he was extremely relieved when I wrote Rules of Civility, and so pleased to see that book was received well by readers.
So we get a lot of questions about an author's kind of writing research process. Grace is asking, do you maintain a daily writing routine? And if you do, what are your favorite writing digital tools? I imagine, especially if you're an outliner, you're probably working on something a little bit every day.
Yeah, I do. I do. I write by a schedule pretty close. I mean, in terms of, meaning I punch the clock. So, put it that way. As a writer, I mean, I'm at my desk every morning by 8:30, and and I'm at my desk until noon, and then I will tend to go have lunch by myself and continue to work through lunch, where I'm editing what I'd written that morning, or I'm planning, thinking about what I'm going to be writing tomorrow, and I guess all writers have an enormous array of practices. Successful, talented writers. I've come to know many, and they all kind of have their own ways of approaching things. But I do find that most would tend to punch the clock. I mean, they're not, wandering in the woods waiting for inspiration to hit them. They've committed to treating it as a profession, and they do sit down and force themselves to be at the desk, whether they have a good idea or not that day, whether they're in the mood or not that day. And I think that's because they have found, as I have found, as we all found eventually, that inspiration is what happens when you go and sit at your desk at 8:30 in the morning every day. That's where inspiration comes. And so you just got to sit down and do it. I do a lot of work. I'll take a step back because it's sort of in the spirit of this bigger question. For me, I will tend to start with an idea that's very simple. So in the case of Gentleman in Moscow, I was in a hotel, and I thought, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to live in a hotel? And I sort of had that notion in the lobby as I was taking the elevator upstairs. I thought, yeah, that's actually a pretty interesting idea for a book. What if a guy got trapped in a hotel for a long period of time? That was it. That's the idea. Now, very often when I have an idea like that, as in the case of Gentleman in Moscow, I went to my hotel room, and in the first 3 hours, I had sketched out the key elements to that story, the scaffold of it. He'll be in Russia. He'll be an aristocrat sentenced to house arrest. He'll be in the fancy hotel across the street from the Kremlin. There'll be a little girl he befriends. He'll become a waiter. His nemesis will be another waiter who's sort of a party guy. And it kind of, I all knew all that within a couple of hours. And by the end of the weekend, I had really sketched out in greater detail all the key components of what was going to happen in the book. Most of them, the key players, the settings, and the characters, and the events, kind of in rough sense. When that happens, and I have an idea like that, and it's grabbed me, and I've begun to see it with some clarity and with some excitement, what I'll then do is I'll spend a couple of years, what I call designing the book, and so, I'll show you. Let's see what these. There we go. Yeah. Well, so this is when Lincoln Highway, same kind of thing. I had an idea immediately I was like, oh yeah, kids in a car, in the trunk of the warden's car. Our hero gets off track. He wants to go to California, ends up going to New York. Is when I have an idea like that, again, I'm like, oh, it'll be in the Midwest. It'll be in the 1950s. It'll take 10 days, the whole story. Then what happens is I start doing this. This is, it's just a moleskin notebook, and I will do it by hand. And this is July 2014. I mean, when did Lincoln Highway come out? I guess in 2021. So this is 7 years before I'm writing in this notebook, and then you keep adding notebooks. And it was called Unfinished Business.
Yeah, the title's different.
Changed the title of the Lincoln Highway, thank God. But that's just all what I call design. And I'm using those notebooks to flesh out the characters, to imagine the settings, understand them, to picture all the events that are going to happen, to get a sense of the tone, to get a sense of everybody's voice, the various characters. And when I've filled a number of notebooks and I get to the point where I know the book entirely. I mean, I know everything that happens and everything is, and I can see it very vividly, and I have a sense of what it's going to sound like and feel like. Then I will outline and begin the process of writing the book, which will then take me a couple of years. So that's kind of my process in the bigger scheme of things.
That was
I'm sorry. And as kind of implied in this, I do a lot of writing by hand, but I obviously also work with a keyboard. And in fact, when I'm sitting down at my desk at 8:30 in the morning, that is usually in front of a keyboard, because if I know what I'm working on, I cannot write by hand fast enough to keep up with my thought process. The notebooks are really great during the invention process, where I don't necessarily know where I'm going, and I keep revising the paragraph as I'm getting closer and closer to my understanding of what it should sound like. And so, in a way, that's better to do by hand. Almost like in the way sketching, a model or sketching a landscape by hand in a rough sense kind of allows you to kind of connect them to what you're looking at before you get into the precision of painting in fine detail.
So when you do start, hitting the keyboard, do things change as you're writing, or do you stay pretty close to that outline?
Enormously. I mean, if you read, the first draft of the first 4 paragraphs of a chapter of one of my books, you'd be like, "Are you kidding?" Half the sentences don't even finish, because it's true. I mean, I'd be zipping along and I'll say, "Oh yeah, in the room, the light came through the window." I'll be like, "Yeah, I get that. Move on," and then I'll figure that out later. Or I'm like, "Something he thinks something here. I'm not sure what," and then I keep moving on. So I mean, I end up with these paragraphs that it took me half an hour to write the first draft of the paragraph. It's going to take me 3 weeks to fix it, because but then you write the whole first draft, and then changes are constantly occurring. Even, changes from what I originally conceived, changes in the editing process, through the writing, you're constantly gaining a better sense of what the whole thing should be. And so you have to be prepared to enrich your sense of the outline that you have by what you're learning through the writing process. And that's what happens to me. When I'm writing the first third of the book, the outline is becoming increasingly detailed for the back half of the book, because I'm learning more about the characters, more about the events, more about the settings, more about the objects, whatever, learning about the book through the writing of it. And then you kind of adjust the outline to incorporate your greater understanding of what the book should be.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And it makes what I want to ask Myra's question, which is, during that time then in that writing process, have you found that there's been something that's surprised you or delighted you, that or frustrated you or challenged you, that you weren't expecting?
Well, let's take them in 2 steps. Let's do frustration first.
Okay.
For my 3 novels, Rules of Civility, A Gentleman in Moscow, and The Lincoln Highway, I have had a major crisis of confidence. Usually it hits me around the 30% mark, where I'm usually thinking, this doesn't sound right. It's not interesting. It's going nowhere. It's misguided. It's boring. And the whole project is probably a mistake. That level of doubt, and when that happens, you have to kind of take a step back and rethink where you are. And rather than throw out the project and walk off in despair and going to get drunk at a bar or something like that, you have to say, okay, before I quit, maybe I'll retreat from the material, dwell on it for a minute, and see if I can figure out how to save it. I was so excited about it at the beginning, and it's got things in it that I like. So what's wrong? And so in the case of The Lincoln Highway, and this is kind of an odd story, but it's true. As those of you who've read it know, it's a 10-day story. And when I designed it, the 10 sections, and it's told from 8 different points of view. And it was day 1, you hear from different people and the events would occur. And then day 2, and so it's almost like 10 sections. Each section would have multiple chapters because you're hearing from the different people and the events unfold. This was the way the book was designed from the beginning, that it would be 10 days. And the outline said day 1, day 2, day 3. I got to this point where I had the crisis I was describing. I don't know it doesn't make any sense. It's boring. It's misguided. I don't know where it's going. It's whatever. It's a mess. Walked away from it. And then you can have these weird kinds of epiphanies. The epiphany here was that suddenly it occurred to me, the whole problem is that this book is not, the story is not day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This story is 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's a countdown. Because what happens in the book is that a series of events occur which are propelling the characters towards almost an inescapable fate. And every day that goes by, you're moving more closely and faster towards this unavoidable set of circumstances, this conclusion, which they, as time goes on, it's harder and harder for them to change their course, to change the course of action. And that's the feeling from the beginning that the thing was supposed to have, this sort of feeling of this moving, of running out of time before you fix things, of moving rapidly towards your fate in a shrinking realm of opportunity, that things could be fixed, let's say. And so as soon as I thought that, I went back to the outline and I didn't change the course of events. I just changed the title. Literally, I said 10. Instead of saying day 1, it now said 10. Instead of saying day 2, it said 9. Instead of saying day 3, it said 8 in the outline. And that allowed me to go back to the beginning and begin to rethink what I'd written so far, but in the frame of mind of, does this fulfill the promise of the countdown? Does it fulfill it in terms of the urgency, in terms of the sense of momentum, in terms of the sense of fate? And so I didn't have to throw out the first third by any means. I just went back and cleaned it, and I got rid of some things, and I sharpened some things and added some things that brought it more in line with the countdown. And when you read the book today, that's the way it's presented in the 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 format.
That's amazing that little tweak completely changed your mindset.
Save the book. And yes, and it was a complete, and it can be that way. And that's the nature of an epiphany, is it's a small, sudden awareness that can have big ramifications, whether in life or in art. So that was the part 1. That's the crisis. That had a happy ending, I guess. The second one was sort of the pleasant surprises. And sure, that happens all the time. I mean, not a page goes by virtually without it happening. And, you realize, oh, this is, he doesn't pick up this, he picks up that, or he doesn't put it back on the shelf, it breaks, or she doesn't say this, she says the opposite, you're constant, or, so-and-so arrives. Oh my God, of course, or this would be just the moment that so-and-so would arrive and screw up everything. You have these things that you discover no matter how carefully you plan, and those are great. You want to have great, big confidence in those, because those surprises tend to be full of energy and wisdom. So a big example is, and this can happen, and this is kind of relevant, and it's going to have a sales pitch attached to it. I didn't mean that, but so when I was writing Rules of Civility, for those who know that book, the main character, the narrator, Katie, is a 25-year-old woman. It's New York, 1938. She's from a working class background, and that book is a year in her life as she begins to climb the social ladder and the professional ladders of New York. So it's not where she arrives at a great new job and a great new social status. It's where she begins to see how it could happen. And she begins to take those first steps, and you can kind of see her life taking off. That's really what the book is about in this year. Well, her roommate is this character, Evelyn Ross, who's a real troublemaker. She's terrific. And halfway through the novel, she gets disenchanted for a variety of reasons. And she's even 2/3 of the way through the novel. And she says, I'm going home to Indiana. I called my folks. They're going to pick me up at the train, but I'm out of town. I'm out of New York. I'm done with New York. She gets on the train, and she goes to Indiana, and I am writing per the outline. The parents. I'm describing the parents coming into the station and what they're going to see when they see their daughter, who is kind of a changed person to some degree, but from her life, from her independent years in New York, and they're going to sort of greet her, both miss her, but be she's also a stranger to them in a way. So that's what I'm imagining writing. And I'm right up to the point where I'm about to describe it. And suddenly it occurs to me, she would never get off that train. There's no way that Evelyn Ross would ever get off the train, meet her parents in Chicago in order to return to Indiana. And so sure enough, she didn't get off the train. The parents call Eve and say, call Katie in New York and say, what happened? She wasn't on the train. And Katie's like, she got on the train. So the parents track down through the train agency, and they find out that while the train was approaching Chicago, she bought a ticket to Los Angeles. And so ends up in Hollywood in 1938. And at the very end of Rules of Civility, you get a glimpse of that. Katie, in kind of wrapping up what happened to her friends of that year, she talks about seeing a picture of Eve in Hollywood with Olivia de Havilland coming out of a nightclub in the spring of 38. Anyway, that's one of those surprises. Now, what ended up happening is that when Rules of Civility was done, I was like, oh, that's perfect. I don't need to tell anybody ever again anything about Katie or Tinker. I've told them everything they should know. Anything else that they want to imagine for Katie and Tinker, they should, but I'm not going to do it. That's perfectly told. But I was like, what in the heck is Eve doing in Hollywood? And so right after that book was written, or in the 2 years after, so back in like around 2012, 13, I imagined the first 3 months of Eve in Hollywood, told it sort of from 6 perspectives, sort of this little vignettes that kind of introduce her arrival in Hollywood and her start but it's rather enigmatic. It's rather short, but I was glad I did it. But then, over the decade, it just kept bugging me, that, I did not do justice to what happened to her when she arrived. So I went back last year and picked up those 6 vignettes, and I expanded that work, threefold, to the point where it's now, I think, close to a 200-page novella. And it definitely does justice. It's the story that Eve deserved all along. And so I have the collection of short stories that comes out in April called Table for Two, and that is 6 short stories set roughly in contemporary New York City, but it also includes Eve in Hollywood, this 200-page novella of Eve and what happens to her in Hollywood in 1938. So that all goes back to the surprise while I was writing, the train scene 10 years ago.
That's amazing. That's incredible. That's definitely even more
amazing, incredible. I'll take both of those.
Yeah. So I'm kind of stuttering over it because we had so many questions about whether or not you ever feel like you need to revisit characters because they're just kind of like needling at you.
Yeah.
And I am from Indiana, and I loved Eve, and so I was just like, what's going on with Eve? So I'm really happy to hear that I get to read a little bit more about Eve. So I know that you've said in past interviews that you kind of do your research after you've done a lot of your writing. And Amy is asking, why do you do it that way? And do you do all of your writing before you dive into research?
Well, I think the key thing here for me, and different writers approach this in different ways. I was on a panel not long ago with Rebecca Mackay, and she was talking about the important role that research plays in her work. And it doesn't dominate her work by any means. But it plays an important role. And as she was describing it, I was like, oh man, I should be doing what she's doing, maybe, but we all approach it differently. So this is not, what I'm going to say is not the rule of thumb that all should follow, and it's just the way I do things, but I try to write books about things that I feel confident that I can invent them based on what I know. Mm-hmm. So that may seem surprising, like when I read a book about Russia from 1920 to 1950. I don't speak Russian. I didn't study Russian history in college. I don't have any Russian heritage. I had only been to Russia maybe 10 days in my life when I wrote the book. But what I had done is I had become interested in the Russian novel as a teenager, and I'd read all the 19th century greats, and then I'd gone on to read the avant-garde, read about the avant-garde in Russia before the First World War, and then I got interested in the Revolutionary period, and then I read some of the fiction by the dissidents, like Solzhenitsyn and the others who were trapped within the Soviet era and the regime. And so by the time I had the idea about the hotel, I had, close to 30 years of knowledge accumulated about life in Russia, just because I was a fan of the culture. And so Guy Trapped in a Hotel, I could have set that anywhere in the world. But, I could have set it in Pinochet, in South America under Pinochet, some place where there were, another authoritarian government. But I wouldn't have never have done that because I could never have imagined that story. I don't know enough about that world, and and I don't know enough about it deeply enough to encourage the imagination. But Russia I did. So that's why immediately I was like, oh, great, set it in Russia. No problem. I imagine the whole thing, and I keep track of things I might want to know better or that I want to sharpen. And then when I'm done with the first draft, I then go and do the applied research to double check things or look at things a little bit more closely, or rethink elements based on, revisiting of a historical text of some kind. But why do I put off that, that kind of work for most of it at any rate? And again, I know a lot already to start with, right? So I don't want to overstate this, but a reason I put off the applied research is that I feel like I've read works where you can hear the novelist's research dropping into the book in a kind of a leaden way. I think it's very hard. You go down the rabbit hole of Wikipedia, and you get more and more facts, and it's more and more interesting and more compelling, and you just start sweeping it into the narrative. But you're no longer imagining the life of the character. You're beginning to find interesting and fun things that could populate a book, and that's just you're coming at it from a different angle. And I am wary of that. At least I'm wary about it for me. And so I want to bring my characters to life. I want the environments to be vivid. I want the emotions to be heartfelt. And so the factual stuff can wait, and we can figure that out later. The sharper factual things. And some of it doesn't matter, and as I say, I never spent a night in the Metropole Hotel when I wrote Gentleman in Moscow. I finished the first draft. I put it in a suitcase and I flew to Russia, and I moved into the hotel, and I began revising the book inside the Metropole Hotel in a suite, in the Count's suite.
Fun facts about you.
Yeah. That was great fun. But one of the first things I discovered upon arriving at the Metropole Hotel, or I kind of knew, but I hadn't really double checked, is that the Count, as most of you know, the first day of the book, gets sent out of his fancy suite on the 3rd floor to the attic of the 6th floor of the Metropole, where he has to live in his old servants' quarters in a dusty attic, and that's where he lives for the remainder of the book. And there is no 6th floor of the Metropole Hotel, and I don't mind the fact that much of that book takes place in a space which is imagined on the roof of the building, And one funny thing is that I got to know the manager of the hotel, and when I saw him some years later, he's like, oh, it's great. We love the book, and we love all these people come to the hotel, and they want to eat here or tour here or sleep here, and they have the book in hand. He said the only problem is that they all want to go to the 6th floor, and I have to constantly be telling them there is no 6th floor, and they're so disappointed. But I think that's terrific. I don't mind that at all.
Creative license. So we have a lot of questions about structure. So your first book, Rules of Civility, A Year in the Life of Katie, A Gentleman in Moscow, describes 3 decades of the life of Count Rostov. And then the Lincoln Highway, as you talked about, happens in 10 days.
Yes.
So Lauren is saying, how do you master a transition between the different writing styles, such as the accordion style in A Gentleman in Moscow, to these shifting points and a countdown kind of style in the Lincoln Highway?
Well, I mean, the short answer is you really master it by doing it, but you're on the right track, honorable questioner, and that, the reason I was like, oh, I'll write Lincoln Highway next. Which was, call it unfinished business, as I said. One of the reasons I was like, after I finish John Moscow, I'll do that story, is because one was a 30-year story, and the other was a 10-day story. And one was a sophisticated aristocrat with who's in middle age, and the other is about 18-year-old boys who are very unsophisticated. Is the shift from the contrast of those stories is what drew me to doing the Lincoln Highway next. Because to do that story well, the Lincoln Highway well, I have to master how to tell a story in a very different way. And that's what's exciting for me, is to take all that I've learned about writing since I was a young person, and all the different stories I've written on and imagined, is to use that background of knowledge and the elements of craft that I have mastered, but then to sort of still ask yourself, well, I'm going to tackle something that I haven't done. and that's going to be part of the adventure. And then that's part of the advantage of the design phase, because the telling of a 10-day story is radically different from the telling of a 30-year story. And just to, as an example, for those of you who read A Gentleman in Moscow, you know this, but if you're going to tell a 30-year story, it is bound to be about evolution, because your character over the course of that time frame is evolving as an individual, right? His sentiments, his intelligence, his memories are all changing over time with as he goes through life. His relationships are evolving. So, a flirtation becomes a full-blown romance. A sort of a silly job becomes his best friends. A young girl he's supposed to keep an eye on becomes a daughter. The relationships evolve. The world is evolving around the hotel. Russia is changing. So it's extremely natural for a 30-year tale to be about evolution. A 10-day story is not going to be. Not in that same way. You can't. You don't have the aperture in which to watch things unfold over a long period of time. So instead, you're looking at how might this very narrow moment of time have had huge impact on these lives in a way that we can anticipate. Even if we don't get to see what happened 10 years or 20 years or 30 years from now, we can imagine how these 10 days had this outsized impact. And what's happened to them in the past has to be sort of swept into the story artfully, so that we can get a sense of the grander scope of their lives, even though we're only seeing through this narrow window. So that became the challenge. That's what makes it fun for me as an artist, is can I take what I know and retool all the elements of craft to serve this very different story? But you only really begin to master it by doing it. So when you'd finish the 10-day story, you could say, oh, let's do the next 10 days. I can do that like that, But no, you got to go and do something totally different.
Yeah, so you bring up kind of weaving things in artfully, and what amazes me a lot about your work is the fact that it's your work is art, but then all of the art that you put in your work.
Yeah.
I mean, art, like art, photography, food, music, even fashion, rules of civility. I loved the descriptions of the clothing and everything. So how does art play a role in your life, and how does it inform your writing?
Well, I love culture. I'm a humanist. I was a humanities major, more or less, at Yale, and studied the humanities again as a graduate student. I surround myself with books, and there's paintings on the walls around me. So I love art. I love music, and so it's very natural for me to weave it into narratives, and I don't do that to achieve some sort of artistic outcome necessarily. I really do it because I think it's the way. I think it's very true to life to do it, and I mean that in the sense that if you had a cocktail party, or any of you listening, tomorrow night, or a dinner party, you had a dinner party with 6 of your friends or whatever, and I sat there and listened to the entire conversation unfold, I guarantee it would, over the course of the conversation, for sure, it would be, what are you watching, right? Streaming. Oh, have you seen, looking back in time, oh, Breaking Bad. Have you seen Breaking Bad? It's incredible, or whatever it is that you're watching today. Slow Horses, awesome. Oh, you haven't seen that? You've got to see Slow Horses. And we all talk about what we're watching. This summer we were all talking about, have you seen Barbie? Have you seen Oppenheimer? Have you seen them both? Yeah. And so that's a natural part of the way that we socialize, the way we share our own sort of insights about the way the world is. It's the way that we talk about what we're surprised and what we were moved by and what we hated. But it's true of music. I'm never. Taylor Swift, this extraordinary tour that she went on this summer, going to speak to sing to 100,000 people at a time, or 80,000 people at a time. And the number of people who would just sort of mention Taylor Swift's work, or I don't know, do you know it? Or I love this, I don't like that, or I went and saw it, and it was incredible. But anyway, that, it comes into the conversation. Of course, here in New York, the theater is being discussed all the time, whether it's the musicals or it's the Pulitzer Prize winning dramas, the art of the museums, Museum of Modern Art, Metropolitan, are being discussed all the time, not by everybody, but they're a part of the fabric of daily life. And so, as I say, I think it's very natural for the arts that we experience in the course of our daily lives to incorporate them into a narrative, just as they are, incorporated into the way we interact with each other.
Mhm. Well, thank you for doing that because it's beautifully done.
Thank you.
Hillary's saying in Rules of Civility, you captured the thoughts and attitudes of a young woman very well in the character of Katie Content. Why use a female lead?
I always imagine that story from the perspective of Katie. It never occurred to me to tell it from a different perspective. And that's the kind of the honest answer. But now, what's behind an answer like that? Because I'm not being flip at all. Is I come from an era, and it wasn't unique to my era by any means. But the when I was a young writer, I'm approaching 60 years old now. I'm 58. When I was a young writer, as now, many young writers would try to master their craft through the short story. That's where you experimented with setting and with tone of voice and with characterization and elements of plot and obviously the language itself, the poetics of it, the opening, the closing. The short story is the proving ground. These different elements and try to master them in the course of 10 pages, and therefore in the course of a month, instead of over 500 pages in 3 years. And so you can kind of go from story to story to story, working on different aspects of the craft, or approaching the aspects of the craft from a different angle. Well, a critical component of that experimentation for me and for many was taking on different voices. That's the whole point, right? So you would tell a story from the perspective of an old man in Vienna, and then you tell a story from the perspective of a young black girl in the South, and you tell a perspective from the story of a hippie in Berkeley in the 60s, and you tell a story perspective from somebody else's, and each time you make that shift, and you're telling from a different perspective, what you're gaining from that experiment is it forces you to not use the language you're used to using yourself, the voice in your head, but to explore how somebody else with a totally different background and a different set of circumstances, what would they sound like? What would they feel like at the beginning of the day? When they walked into a room, what would they see? But given their perspective, they walk into a party, and how would they describe the party? Every person who arrives at a party is going to describe it differently based on who they are and what they love, what they hate, what their own bag is, what their issues are. And so you're trying to get into that ability of understanding, trying to figure out a person's perspective. And that goes right down to the words they use and the expressions they use, the way they process emotions, what their sense of humor is like, how cynical they are, how they process things psychologically. This is what creating a human, the illusion of a human in a fiction requires. At its best. So there was this constant experimentation with taking on different points of view. So when I come up with a new story, one of the first things that kind of presents itself to me is, oh, who's telling this? Whose perspective is this going to be from? And so with Katie, it was easy. I knew it was from Katie's perspective in the first minute. Lincoln Highway, a little bit different in that story was going to be from just the two perspectives of Emmett and Duchess. And I wrote a quarter of the book with that in mind. So the whole thing was going to be just Emmett and Duchess back and forth. And I got about a quarter of the book and I was like, you know what? This is not right, because I know Sally so well and she's awesome. And the readers will never get a clear sense of who she is by just listening to Emmett and Duchess describe her. And that's true of Woolley too. I knew him so well, and the reader deserved to hear what he sounds like from the inside out. And so I restructured that book to sort of say, I'm going to hear from all these people, and each of the chapters is going to sound a little different as we go from Emmett to Duchess to Sally to Woolley to Billy to Ulysses and so on. And you try to, I say, capture what is the voice that belongs to them. So it's a long answer, but why a woman? Because it's the way I presented myself to me. But more importantly, the reason I didn't hesitate about doing so is because I spent my life telling stories from different perspectives, and that's what I view as one of my principal jobs.
I always wonder, do you start to dream as the character? Like when you're really into the characters, like people start to dream in another language once they start immersing themselves
I
in.
don't. That does not really happen. Maybe it's happened a couple of times. But I am. It's more that during my waking hours, the person can be on my mind almost the entire day. You know, particularly when I'm in the thick of writing something like A Gentleman in Moscow, the Count is with me at all times. And you know, and I can hear him, the way that he would analyze the restaurant I'm sitting in, you know, and things that he would do would suddenly occur to me by virtue of me witnessing something, but hearing how he would, you know, his take on it kind of in the background of my mind.
Mhm. Okay, that's
And same with Katie in the year I was writing Rules of Civility. She was with me, you know, all the time.
it's like during the day, it's almost kind of like method acting, like you're just in
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
It's very much, and I have friends who are actors, and we talk about that the approach of my friends who've studied in the method acting training, it's very similar what I'm doing, because you're trying to know enough about the person, their background, their psychology, their fears, their desires, their psychology, that you could then imagine any situation and hear what it would be from them. And that's what method acting is really based on. You know, forget for a second the play you're going to act, take a step back and try to know everything there is about to know of the character, such that you could be in any play in which that character was in, any situation. And so yes, it's very the two arts are very closely aligned.
So we have some questions about kind of the crossovers in the
Yeah.
novels,
Yeah.
and I think maybe this one's probably not very tenable, but Katie is the daughter of Russian immigrants, and then the next book that you write is A Gentleman in Moscow.
Yeah.
Was that intentional or just circumstance because of the character and who she presented to be?
That is not that is not the connection between those two books that matters. In that there is no suggestion that Katie is a descendant from anybody who is in the story of A Gentleman in Moscow. So in that sense, it is kind of a coincidence. But it goes back to my old love of Russian life, right? You know, so when I was inventing Katie, I was like, oh great, you know, she's gonna be a child of a Russian, because I wanted her to come from a background where, you know, her father would be sort of a hardened individual, not unloving, but used to adversity, you know. And so, you know, a descendant from Russia, they have that sort of tougher, flinty edge to them. But the real connection there, because it is true, there are throughout my work, there are connections to tie the books together, and and then the big one there is, you know, as most of you who read both books know, is Richard Vanderweil, Dickie Vanderweil, who's one of Katie's boyfriends. He's about 25 years old in Rules of Civility. But at the end of Rules of Civility, Katie tells you that that sort of a wild, you know, devil may care, young, wealthy kid, that he turned out all right, because he ended up going to Harvard, you know, business school. And when Pearl Harbor happened, he enlisted. He ended up in the Navy, became an officer, and eventually ended up in the State Department. And she tells us that at the end of Rules of Civility, and they're sort of, you know, looking forward. And he shows up in A Gentleman in Moscow, you know, as a grown-up. I mean, now he's known as Richard Vanderweil, which of course is what, you know, Dickie is short for Richard. I mean, he's works for the State Department when he first shows up. He's working as an attaché for a general, and then eventually the State Department, but which is really, you know, he's a spy. And but it's the same character. And in The Lincoln Highway, of course, for those of you who've read it, you know that Wooly, the character Wooly, who's, you know, is named Wooly because partly because his middle name is Woolkit, is Wallace Woolkit's nephew, and who's a character from Rules of Civility. And in Rules of Civility, actually, Wallace, on his way to going to fight in the Spanish Civil War, leaves behind a present for his namesake, Wallace Jr. You know, his nephew leaves him a watch, a very special watch that Wallace had inherited. He leaves it for Wooly, and Wooly has that watch in the Lincoln Highway, and he then passes it on in the course of the Lincoln Highway. And the Adirondack house in the Rules of Civility is the same house in the Lincoln Highway. So there's always this sort of kinds of things going on in my work, and yes, there will be more of that ahead.
That's good to know. Cynthia is saying, as someone who works in intercultural communication, I'm interested in learning about your strategy for shifting between multiple cultures in your writing, from 30s Manhattan to rural Nebraska, and of course to Russia. How do you
Yeah.
get to know cultures that are distant from your experience in time and place? Which I think we've talked about extensively with reading and
Yeah, and that's true. And you anticipated that. For me, and different people can do this very differently, right? You could have an author who goes and lives in India for months to prepare for doing some work, which ends up in India, or is based in India. I don't know, whatever the version. For me, I use. I'm very interested in narratives from different parts of the world, and from different times, and so and I'm interested in memoirs, sometimes, and I'll kind of go down the rabbit hole of certain memoirs. I'm interested in letters, and I'll read letters between people, and I'm not doing that towards a project, but you kind of accumulate that, and then when you come up with an idea of the project, you're like, oh yeah, that could totally draw on this fascination I've had with X. Now, but visiting those places matters too. So I had been to Russia, as I said. I hadn't been there for months and months and months. I'd been there for 10 days, but I had some very strong impressions from those 10 days that influenced some of the thematic choices I made in A Gentleman in Moscow. They certainly, the time I spent at Red Square is why that book occurs at the Metropole, because of my sort of sense of the Kremlin, Red Square, and the surrounding luxury hotels. So the personal thing can have its bearing too. But yes, I do the written word as something that I can study and mine and internalize is a very powerful tool for me to use. The novels of the time and place.
Kim is asking, many of your characters find a way forward through extremely difficult circumstances in well-known historical eras. So how do you manage to keep the tone from getting too dark?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't, and maybe they should be more dark, right? I mean, you're nice to pose the question that way, but it may be that may be my failing. There's probably a good friend of mine, writing around the corner is probably like, that Towles, he's always too optimistic in his work. For Christ's sake,
Tone it down.
Yeah, really, come on, there should be more disaster. Life is more disastrous than Towles ever gives. But so I don't know. But yeah, for whatever reason, you find your way into the spirit of a character, and the General Moscow, I knew from the beginning that Count Rostov would be a man of great optimism, and that's a sort of that's a big animating force within his life that becomes an animating force in the tone of the work and in the way the events, and it was sort of optimism against, as you kind of implied in the question, the forces of totalitarianism, right? This authority, this incredible battle between individual optimism and the very dispiriting weight of the Soviet institutional agenda, and the violence that it created as well. That's very different than Katie, where really it's about kind of, being in a city where you can see that anything can happen, but not, and wanting it to, wanting your piece of the action, your slice of the pie, but not knowing yet how you're going to get it, and so it requires shoot for her. It's really more like shrewdness is what is, she's not as she's certainly not as friendly and as welcoming and hugging, as the Count. She's a much colder, more cynical person in many ways. She's also has a beautiful sentimentality too, as well as a part of that. But like young people who come from a tough neighborhood in New York, they've got a little bit of an edge, and Katie has that edge. And so, that's an animating factor for her. The characters of the Lincoln Highway, it's a big spread, and you have, Emmett's great practical strength, and you have Duchess's wiliness, which is also very charismatic and heartfelt, and you have Willie's, battle with, he's a character in a darker moment where he's battling, in essence, depression, but also his family heritage and his feeling like he's not going to live up to it. And so, that's an animating thing for Willie, even though it's a more tragic component, relative to, the optimism and the positive outcome for the Count.
So I had some interesting commentary come through about whether or not you thought of an alternative ending for the Lincoln Highway, and Jane saying my book club split over this ending.
Okay. Yeah.
They no longer exist because some believe
Oh,
that.
really? Oh, I can't tell whether I should be, apologize or I should be proud of that. But that sounds like maybe proud.
But it was
Um,
just like, yeah, the two parallels. Like half of them thought that
yeah,
it
I
was
get it.
secure,
We don't want to talk. No, no
yeah,
spoilers.
yeah,
But
no spoilers. No spoilers.
the answer to the question is that I knew exactly how Lincoln Highway would end from the first day. I knew exactly what was going to happen to Wooly, to Duchess, and to Emmett. So it was always going in that direction. And for those who I wouldn't, you don't have to read any of my books a second time. So I feel ridiculous saying this, but if you went back and read the book a second time, knowing where it ended, I think you would see how the fate of Duchess and of Willie and Emmett is all, it's, as I say, it's all there building, in a way that is inescapable for them. There's been controversy about the end of Lincoln Highway. Some people have debated the meaning of different things enough. So people reached out to me enough. I finally put it on my website. So I mean, if you go to the Q&A for the Lincoln Highway at amortowles.com, at the very bottom, the very last question, under the sort of answers to frequently asked questions is what's with the ending. Because people ask me, well, did this happen or did that happen? And if they went back and read it carefully, I'm sure they could, they wouldn't need me to spell it out. But they kept asking, so I shared my take on that. And so the two groups, the split, could go to that, and then one of you would be right and one of you wrong, probably, right? And
get your book club back together.
Maybe you get back together, or maybe you'll hate each other even more after that. So maybe it's not going to be much help. But yeah, so that some of that happens. And by the way, because I know we're almost running out of time, I'm sure we didn't get to all of your questions. I do want to say it's awesome that you're all here tonight, and I really appreciate it. Appreciate your interest in my work. Appreciate your taking the time out to be here. Is there a debate tonight? Good Lord. Well, if you're skipping that, thanks. Although maybe I'm doing a favor, I don't know. But anyways, but thank you for coming. If we don't get your question, amortowles.com, if you go to the contact page, it comes right to me. You can send me your question or your comment, and I will try to get back to you, with a response in a reasonable amount of time. But you can always just reach me there too. But I know we're not done with yet. But I know we're probably down to maybe the last question or something like that.
Yeah, probably, because the last question always seems to be the hardest, which is, what is it that you are reading right now, or who are your favorite authors that you recommend that everybody run out to their library and check out immediately?
Wow. I read with a couple of friends. There's 4 of us. We've been reading together for 20 years. We read a novel a month. We have dinner to discuss it. So in essence, we're a book group. It's 2 men, 2 women. We're all married, but our spouses are not involved. And we're all have a literary or writing background. And we read by projects. We'll pick an author and read a series of their books in chronological order. Or we'll pick a time period or a place that we want to dig into, the work for a particular moment in time. We read, as they said, one year we do these projects. We did Nobel Prize winners who didn't write English, so we read Thomas Mann, who we'd all had some experience with, but we had never read, any of us. We all read like The Magic Mountain in college, 30 years ago. But we all went back and we read Buddenbrooks, which was an awesome, terrific, fun, rip-roaring tale, kind of like in a Dickensian format, of a great family and multi-generational saga of this family in Germany, starting in the 19th century. Wonderful experience. In that continued project, we then went and read Naguib Mahfouz, who's the first, I think the only person to win the Nobel Prize in literature writing in Arabic. And he wrote an incredible threesome of books, a trilogy which is collectively called the Cairo Trilogy, about, again, a multi-generational family in Cairo from kind of 1900 to 1950. and all the various the siblings, the father, the mother, the lovers, the sister and the grandchildren, and what happens to the family over the course of the decades while there's a lot of turmoil in Egypt. And there wasn't a history of the novel really in Arabic, and so the culture in Egypt, at least the European culture, I should say, fell, like Mahfouz, fell in love with the Russian novel, the French novel, the British novel, and he's one of the people who kind of brought the art form to Egypt, and sort of asking himself, how can I use what I've learned by reading the European novel, but in the context of Egyptian life? And how can I tell a story that is true to Egyptian life, but somehow is taking advantage of the invention of the novel in Europe? And it's a great experience. So we'll do things like that.
Well, I feel like I need to read more. That's a pretty awesome book club that you have. Okay, so that is time, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, Amor. It's truly been a pleasure to speak with you for the last hour. I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. Below the live stream video, you can find links to Amor's books, including a pre-order link for Table for Two that comes out in April 2024. We look forward to seeing you all on October 10th when we chat with Rick Steves as he imparts some of his top tips and tricks for European travel, and again on October 18th when we talk to best-selling author Ruth Ware. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I'm Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining